Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wright here again for another lesson. So today we're going to be looking at some of the criticisms of the United Nations. So if you haven't watched the video on the UN from our last class, make sure you go back there because you're not going to understand any of the criticisms if you don't understand anything about the UN. So criticisms of the United Nations. Now, I apologize, these borders here might kind of block stuff a little bit. So hopefully that's not too annoying, but it's a PowerPoint being presented on Google Slides. It's a little bit more of a challenge. So there's four main criticisms of the United Nations. So they're based on philosophical and moral criticism. So essentially saying that the UN is essentially corrupt. There's administrative criticisms, essentially saying that it doesn't operate that efficiently. There's effectiveness criticism, saying that the UN is not actually that effective at dealing with issues. And then there are diplomatic and political criticisms, essentially saying that the UN kind of picks sides a little bit, not on a fair basis. So when we look at the moral and philosophical criticisms of the UN, we're essentially looking at this through the eyes of something called moral relativism. And what moral relativism is, it essentially believes that when we do this, we're trying to put our position that our moral or ethical propositions do not reflect universal moral truths, but instead make claims relative to social, cultural, historical, or personal circumstances. Now, that might not make a lot of sense, but essentially what that's saying is that when the UN makes a decision about something, the UN is always under the assumption that what the United Nations does is best. And what they don't realize at times, or what this criticism says, is that the UN doesn't realize that what is good or what is moral in some countries is not the same as what's good or what's moral in other countries. So one example here, and I don't know if you guys remember this, but if you remember back to the Arab Spring in the early 2000s, and probably not, you guys would have been very, very young. The Arab Spring was essentially a bunch of countries in the Middle East and Africa started to rise up against their dictatorships, right? Most of those countries are ruled by religious dictators. So like Syria, Egypt, Libya. And in these countries, the people started to rise up and essentially try to get democracy for themselves. Now, the UN decided to go in some of these cases, or certain countries did, to try to help these people rise up against their governments. Now, what happened in some of these cases is that it wasn't actually the majority of people that wanted this change. And in fact, the majority of people in some of these countries didn't want these changes. And the UN saw essentially that democracy is good, right? Everybody should have democracy because that's what the UN said is the best type of government. But that might not be the best type of government for certain countries around the world. Some people are happy to live under a dictator. Some countries just operate a little bit better like that. If you look at a place like Syria right now, like Syria is one of the worst places in the world to live. If you were to go back in time 25 years into Syria, Syria is one of the more stable, more profitable, more kind of free uh, countries in the Middle East. But now that countries like the United States, France, and Britain have gone in there and tried to enforce democracy upon it, it's become relatively war torn. And now groups like ISIS have taken over large portions of it. So essentially what moral relativism really works or means it's that we're taking what we think is good and what we think is the right way of doing things, and we're trying to force other people into our belief system. So times in the past when moral relativism has led to some truly awful things, moral relativism was used to essentially justify what Hitler was doing to the Jewish people in the Holocaust. Hitler believed morally that Jewish people were evil and that they were wrong and that they were essentially damaging the society of Germany. So in his mind, it was morally correct to eliminate those people from his country. Right now, we know that's not good, but Hitler was able to justify it to himself and to a large portion of his followers that essentially what we're doing here morally justifies what we're doing in other places, right? Like when the UN goes in and bombs Syria in order to overthrow the government, they're killing people. But when they're killing people, they're essentially saying it's for the betterment or it's for the good in the end, right? So when we try to justify things that are bad with our ideals, right, that can be kind of a problem. And I know some of this was probably confusing. I probably didn't explain it all that well on here. So if that doesn't make sense, come to one of the meets and I can kind of explain it a little bit better. But I'm doing this in a dark office in my house, so it's not going to be perfect. So the UN was also founded by states that declared war on the Axis powers during World War II. So the countries that founded the UN were countries that basically saw Italy, Germany, and Japan as evil, right? So there is a little bit of a bias there. Like the UN has essentially decided what is evil and what is not, and based on that, it's going to make a lot of its decisions. So the UN originally wanted to take a stand against evil and oppressive regimes. So again, they wanted to avoid dictatorships, they wanted to avoid monarchies and all of that. And they wanted to only have democratic countries in there. But now the UN has 75 member states who are of non-democratic countries, right? So countries like Syria, like Egypt, like Oman are all essentially theocratic dictatorships who are allowed into the UN. So at one point we said that it had to be democratic and that had to be right, and now we're essentially moving the goalposts. And well, some non-democratic states can also be allowed in. And the UN has often taken a neutral stance and occasionally supported terrorism and genocide. So in some cases, the UN has essentially looked the other way when the result of terrorism or the right of genocide essentially worked in their favor, right? If you don't like the leader of a country, right, you don't think he's best for the rest of the world, you might let a terrorist group or let a rebellious army go in and attack him, even though you know that that's wrong and you say you're trying to be this big peacekeeping organization. But if you can get somebody else to get rid of a leader you don't like, well, we'll just pretend that's not happening and let the leader we don't like get ousted. That probably made no sense, but I don't really know how to explain that better without drawing things on my whiteboard. So some examples of this in the United Nations, in 2011, the United Nations held a moment of silence to mourn the death of Kim Jong-il of North Korea. So Kim Jong-il is probably, or was probably, one of the worst human beings alive in 2011. North Korea is a very oppressive communist dictatorship. He was not a very well-liked man around the world. I definitely would not be the sort of person that you'd want at a United Nations meeting, but they did hold a moment of silence to mourn his death, right? In theory, the UN should have been, I don't want to say celebrating his death because that's a little bit grim, but when a bad person dies, that is not a bad thing. Like, not to compare Kim Jong-il with Hitler, but there are some minor similarities between the two, and we never had a moment of silence for the death of Hitler. So the United Nations also allows members to remain in the UN after committing crimes which go against the United Nations founding principles. So Saudi Arabia, Iran, North Korea, even if you look, like Canada and the United States have done things that go against the United States' founding principles, right? In the United States, the United States in the 1960s had a lot of racial issues going on, right? The United Nations, one of their founding principles is multiculturalism and equality, but we allow these countries that do things that go against their founding principles to remain in our countries, right? Iran has basically publicly said their goal is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. North Korea has one ambition, that's to destroy South Korea. In Saudi Arabia, most of the 9/11 terrorists were actually from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a dictatorship. Saudi Arabia kills journalists that essentially try to bring attention to news of what's going on in Saudi Arabia. But all of these countries are allowed to remain in the United Nations. So another thought here, another criticism on a moral standpoint of the UN, is that they believe it's a globalist organization. Now that's becoming a very catchy term. Like if you were to look at yellow vest protests or people at like Donald Trump rallies or conservative rallies here in Canada, you'll see a lot of signs that say like "Say no to UN globalists." And what that essentially means is that some people believe the United Nations is attempting to become the global government. And what they believe is that the UN is trying to take power away from individual governments and give it to themselves as like a global ruler, right? Which is nothing that like you and me, when we vote, don't vote for a United Nations representative. The United Nations is democratic in the sense that all countries that are members get a say, but it's undemocratic in the sense that you and me do not get to elect our representative to the United Nations. So the UN does have some powers that can influence individual countries. That's just the way it is. The World Trade Center or World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF essentially control the global pool of money. They can pass trade laws, they can put bans or embargoes or trade blocks on basically any country around the world. And through that, they can kind of influence countries in an unfair way. So some people believe that there is a flaw in the way that the United Nations runs from an administrative standpoint. So some people criticize the UN, saying that there are way too many elite countries in the UN and that these elite countries have way too much power. So this most specifically is directed towards the Security Council. So China, France, Russia, Britain, and the United States. All 5 of these countries have nuclear weapons that are unchecked. What that means is nobody actually knows how many nuclear weapons any of those 5 countries have. Any country that is not those 5 has to essentially report and can only have a certain amount of nuclear weapons. But China, France, Britain, Russia, and the United States have untold amounts. The United States could have 1, the United States could have 1 billion, and nobody would really know. Whereas if a country like Canada, who doesn't have any nuclear weapons, but if we wanted to, we would have to let the UN know how many we had. The Security Council has no true international representation. If you look at those 5 countries, okay, you have 1 from North America, you have 2 from Europe, and you have 1 from Asia. There is no South American, there is no African, and besides, like, Asia is the most populated continent in the world, and only 1 Asian country has a seat on it. There are a lot of people that think India should get a seat on the Security Council, and a lot of people that think Brazil should also be up there to try to get some more influence. But no African, no South American. If you look at the 2 places that were treated the worst in colonization, Africa and South America, right? What you essentially have here is you have basically 4 countries of white European descent, and then you kind of have the global powerhouse of Asia as China. So these 5 countries control all major UN decisions. We talked about that in the last video. And many nations argue that at least one of these UN countries should be a non-nuclear power. What that means is they want one of the countries on the UN Security Council to give up their nukes. Now, the reason for this is because when these 5 countries all have nukes, they essentially all have like the cheat code to win any conflict, right? Or they have the ability to start any war, okay? Or essentially start the war, blow up the world, either or. And what they want is they want one of these countries to represent the rest of the world who does not have nuclear weapons, right? If, let's say, hypothetically, France had no nuclear weapons, they would be much more in favor of laws and policies that are going to limit the amount of nuclear weapons countries can have. But since France can have nuclear weapons, they probably want to have the more the better because, well, I want to have 30 million nuclear weapons instead of 20 million nuclear weapons, right? So they want one of those countries to represent like the non-nuclear states. Some accuse the Security Council of only acting in their best interests and not those that are best for the world. Okay, we talked about that a little bit back when we looked at all the different vetoes in the last video. But for example, the UN decided to intervene in Kuwait, stopping Saddam Hussein of Iraq from invading oil-rich Kuwait. So the UN said, no, we're not going to let Saddam Hussein collect oil from Kuwait. And instead, the UN went in and stopped them. And now Kuwait supplies oil to, shockingly, all 5 security member states. But the UN decided not to go into Rwanda because in Rwanda, there was no oil. It was just Rwandans, right? So basically prioritizing, we need oil, so we'll save an oil-rich country. We don't need Rwandan African people, so we won't save the Rwandan African people. There's also some people that believe the UN is not actually a democratic organization. They believe that the leaders represent their own best interests of the General Assembly, but not those of the citizens they're supposed to represent. So again, I guess I can't do this over a video because you'll just Google this. But if we were in class, I would say I get 5% bonus on the next unit exam to anybody that can tell me who Canada's UN representative is, and none of you would know it because you have no idea because you never vote for it. I couldn't name who it is off the top of my head right now because we really don't, unless they're in the news about something, we don't know who it is. Okay, so some people believe that the United Nations essentially is not relevant anymore and therefore it's not effective. So some people believe that the United Nations does not actually do anything in preventing or resolving conflicts. Now, if you're to look at what's going on in the world right now, we have a whole bunch of different conflicts going on. We have the Syrian situation. We have Israel and Palestine. We have North Korea. We have like a whole bunch of different like coups and civil wars going on in South America, and the UN is essentially not doing anything to prevent those conflicts or to stop them. So some people believe that the UN is basically just there to observe and report, okay? Because the Security Council cannot agree on anything, right? We looked at those videos in the last video, so they don't actually do anything. Now, the counterpoint of that is that when the UN does decide to do something, they are about 67% effective in resolving that conflict peacefully. Okay, now that was done by the RAND group, which is like a bunch of accountants that go in and they analyze numbers to find out how like well your companies ran. So in 2005, they said that when the UN decided to actually do something, 67% of the time they were successful in reducing or ending the conflict. Now, 67, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, is a passing grade. Now, being in a -1 class with you guys all having hopes of going on to third -1 in the university, that's not a great mark, right? It's especially not a great mark when that 33% that you're missing are human lives, right? If you go to a country that has 10 million people and you save 67% of them, well, you save 6.7 million people, but 3.3 million people died at the same time, right? That's not great odds. Imagine if your odds of surviving COVID-19 were 67%, right? Right now, your odds of surviving COVID-19, if you get it, are like 98%, right? That's a much better chance. If you get it, odds are you're going to be fine. If 3 people in your family got COVID and it was 67%, well, probably one of them is going to die from it, right? So it's a passing grade. It's not exactly a great grade either. So some people believe that the United Nations does not work from a political standpoint, and they essentially believe that it doesn't do anything. It can't prevent these conflicts, and it can't prevent its conflicts because of how it's defined. Right? The United Nations cannot interfere in the sovereign actions of a state within its own borders. So whatever a country wants to do within its own borders are supposed to be out of the UN's realm of control. Now, the only time this is an exception is when the government of those countries is doing something that causes mass death and suffering. And that's specifically when we're looking at things like genocide or crimes against humanity or UN violations. So essentially, if your country does something that is deemed a genocide or a crime against humanity, the UN can and is supposed to go in and do something. But again, the problem is that you need the Security Council to vote on these things. And what the Security Council most of the time will do in these situations is they will send in peacekeepers to go in and observe as the genocide happens. So, Bangladesh, there were peacekeepers there to watch a genocide. In Srebrenica, which could be called the Bosnian genocide, peacekeepers went in there and they essentially watched what was going on until 100,000 people were dead, and then the UN sent some troops to actually stop it. Darfur, Sudan is basically a civil war or a genocide. Well, it's a genocide that's called a civil war. That's been going on since 2005. Rwanda, we should be familiar with, and then in Syria right now, which if you're not familiar with, you will be over the next few days. All right, so those are the main criticisms of the United Nations. That's going to be all for today. So the next few days are probably going to be a lot of readings and kind of a lot of questions to go along with those readings. So just be prepared for that. And if you have any questions, pop into one of the Google Meets and we can go over them. Other than that, talk to you guys later.